MIT, 1939. Richard Feynman sits in Professor John Wheeler's quantum mechanics seminar. 20 students frantically copy equations from the blackboard, pens racing to capture every symbol before Wheeler erases them. Feynman's notebook remains blank, not empty because he's lost, blank because he refuses to write down what Wheeler says. 3 days later, he'll solve problems that took his classmates 3 weeks to memorize. His method seems insane. While others have perfect notes, color-coded and cross-referenced, Feynman has maybe 5 lines scribbled in the margins. Yet, when exam day arrives, his understanding runs deeper than anyone who copied every word. This wasn't arrogance. It was a systematic approach to self-education that would eventually earn him a Nobel Prize, a method schools never taught because it exposed an uncomfortable truth about the entire system. Formal education trains you to consume information. Feynman's approach forced you to reconstruct it. His IQ was 125, barely above average for a physicist at MIT, yet he consistently outthought colleagues with IQs of 180. He never took a formal course in biology, yet he taught himself enough to publish in biology journals. He decoded Mayan hieroglyphics using principles from physics, no archaeology degree required. He rebuilt quantum electrodynamics from scratch, while others memorized textbooks written by men who came before him. The reason why changes everything about how you learn, and whether you actually need that degree you're chasing. Traditional education operates on a simple model that hasn't changed in centuries. Professors lecture, students transcribe, textbooks provide information, exams test recall, degrees certify compliance. The system promises a clear path. Consume enough information, memorize enough formulas, collect enough credentials, and understanding will follow. This creates a specific problem that millions experience but few can articulate. You finish the online course. You pass the certification exam. You add the credential to your resume. But when someone asks you to explain the concept without referring to your notes, your mind goes blank. When you face a problem that wasn't in the tutorial, you freeze. You borrowed the knowledge long enough to pass the test. You never actually owned it. Documented in his book, Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, he called this phenomenon cargo cult science, the appearance of learning without the substance. He observed students at Brazilian universities who could recite Maxwell's equations perfectly, but couldn't apply them to calculate the electromagnetic field of a simple wire. They had collected the information. They had never built the understanding. Feynman's alternative was considered radical when he arrived at MIT. His roommate documented what others saw as bizarre behavior. Instead of meticulously copying Wheeler's lectures like everyone else, Feynman would sit in class, listen intently, then return to his dorm room with notebooks that looked embarrassingly empty. His challenge to himself: reconstruct the entire lecture from memory using only first principles he already understood. While classmates had perfect transcripts of Wheeler's words but shallow comprehension, Feynman had imperfect notes but deep understanding. The difference wasn't intelligence, it was method. He actively rebuilt the knowledge instead of passively recording it. He forced his brain to do the work that everyone else outsourced to their note-taking. This wasn't about physics. It was about the fundamental difference between consuming information and owning understanding, between collecting credentials and building competence. To see how this method actually worked, we need to examine what happened in those blank notebooks. Wheeler's quantum mechanics seminar ends at 4 p.m. 20 students rush to the library, comparing notes, cross-checking equations, making sure they captured everything correctly. Feynman walks to his dorm room alone. His notebook has maybe 5 lines written in it, just enough to trigger his memory of the lecture's structure. What happened next became his secret weapon for 4 years at MIT. Feynman would sit at his desk, close his eyes, and mentally replay Wheeler's lecture. Not word for word, that would be simple memorization. Instead, he would ask different questions. What problem was Wheeler trying to solve? What assumptions did he make to get there? If I were discovering this for the first time, what path would I take? Then came the reconstruction. Starting from basic principles he already understood: classical mechanics, calculus, electromagnetic theory. Feynman would attempt to rederive Wheeler's equations himself. Sometimes his derivation matched Wheeler's approach. Often it didn't. The errors mattered more than the successes. As he later wrote in the Feynman Lectures on Physics, I learned very early the difference between knowing the name of something and knowing something. His classmates knew the names of the equations. They could recite them on command. Feynman knew how the equations connected to deeper principles. He could rebuild them from scratch. When he got stuck, and he got stuck frequently those first few months, he wouldn't immediately check his classmates' perfect notes. That would defeat the entire purpose. He'd sit with the problem, sometimes for hours. The struggle itself was the education. Each time he failed to reconstruct something, he'd identified a gap in his understanding. Each gap became a specific question to bring to the next lecture. While others collected information, Feynman rebuilt understanding. The cognitive difference is critical to everything that follows. Passive consumption creates what psychologists now call the illusion of competence. You watch a lecture, take notes, feel productive. Your brain registers this as learning, but the information goes into temporary storage. Within days, most of it vanishes. Why? Because your brain never had to wrestle with the material. It just had to transcribe it. Active reconstruction creates durable understanding. When you attempt to rebuild knowledge from first principles, your brain must engage at a completely different level. You discover gaps in your logic. You encounter contradictions you didn't notice when someone else explained it. You're forced to think through relationships between concepts instead of just recording them. This explains why you forget online courses within weeks. But remember problems you struggled to solve for years. The struggle etches the understanding into long-term memory. The passive viewing slides right through. But Feynman discovered something else. This method revealed whether you actually understood something or were just fooling yourself. If you can't reconstruct the knowledge without referring to the source, you don't own it yet. The blank page is brutally honest. It exposes every gap, every shortcut, every piece of borrowed understanding you haven't truly made your own. The same principle applies today when you're learning programming, data analysis, marketing strategy, or any complex skill. Most people watch tutorial videos, copy the code, see it work, and feel accomplished. Then they face a new problem and panic. The knowledge was never theirs. They were following someone else's instructions. Feynman's method forces a different approach. Watch the tutorial once. Close it. Open a blank file. Try to rebuild what you saw from memory. When you fail, and you will fail repeatedly at first, analyze the failure. What principle did you miss? What connection didn't you make? Where did your logic break down? The struggle isn't a bug in the learning process. It's the entire feature. Every time you successfully reconstruct something, you've verified that you own it. Every time you fail, you've discovered exactly what you need to study next. But reconstruction was only the first piece of Feynman's self-education system. His approach to new problems revealed an even more radical principle. Los Alamos, 1943. The Manhattan Project assembles the brightest physicists in America. Most have PhDs from Princeton, Berkeley, and Chicago. Feynman arrives with an incomplete doctorate from MIT and a reputation for being difficult to work with. Brilliant, everyone agrees, but unconventional in ways that make senior scientists uncomfortable. Hans Bethe, who leads the theoretical division, assigns Feynman to calculate neutron diffusion in uranium, a critical problem for determining whether a chain reaction could sustain itself. Standard approach in academic physics. Read the existing literature, study previous attempts at solutions, understand what others have tried, then apply known methods to the specific problem. Feynman does the opposite. Before reading a single paper on neutron diffusion, he spends 3 days attacking the problem with just pencil and paper. No references, no guidance. Just the fundamental laws of physics and his ability to reason from first principles. His first approach fails completely. The math doesn't work. His second approach gets closer, but produces nonsensical results. By the third day, he's filled dozens of pages with failed attempts. Most people would have given up and read the literature by now. Feynman keeps pushing. Then he cracks it, using a technique nobody had documented before because nobody had tried to solve it without reading what came before. When he finally reads the existing papers, he discovers his solution is more elegant than the standard approaches, not because he's smarter, but because he had no loyalty to how it was supposed to be done. Bethe later wrote to a colleague, Feynman's solutions were often more elegant than the textbook methods because he came to problems without preconceptions. He had to solve them, not recognize them. This pattern repeated throughout Feynman's career. When asked to review a physics paper, he developed a specific process. First, he would read only the problem statement, then close the paper and attempt to solve it independently. Sometimes this took days. Only after arriving at his own solution would he read the author's approach. If his solution matched the paper's solution, he knew he genuinely understood the problem. If his solution differed, one of two things was true. Either he'd found an error in the paper, or he'd discovered a gap in his own thinking. Both outcomes were valuable. Both were impossible if he had simply read the paper first and tried to understand the author's logic. Traditional education reverses the natural learning sequence. It says, study the theory first, then practice application. Read the textbook, then do the homework problems. Watch the tutorial, then build the project. This creates a specific cognitive trap. You learn to recognize solutions, not generate them. Someone shows you how to solve differential equations. You practice the exact steps they demonstrated. When the test presents a slightly different type of differential equation, you freeze. You were trained to pattern match, not to reason through the underlying principles. Feynman's approach matched how humans actually build robust understanding. Struggle with the problem first. Exhaust your current knowledge trying to solve it. Then, when you finally study the solution, it clicks instantly because you've already wrestled with the exact difficulties the solution addresses. The conventional method produces what Feynman called intellectual parasites, people who could follow others' reasoning but couldn't reason independently. They could understand an explanation when they heard it, but couldn't generate insight on their own. Problem-first learning produces independent thinkers who can face novel challenges without someone holding their hand. When you're learning data science, every instinct tells you to complete the course first, master the theory, then attempt real projects. This guarantees shallow learning. You'll finish the course, pass the quizzes, even build the example projects. But when you face real messy data that doesn't match the tutorial scenarios, you'll have no idea where to start. Feynman's method flips this completely. Start with a real problem you want to solve, something specific from your own work or curiosity. Attempt it immediately with whatever knowledge you currently have. You will fail, spectacularly. Your code will break. Your analysis will be wrong. Your approach will be naive. Now, study the course material. But you're not passively consuming anymore. You're hunting for answers to specific questions you've already formulated through your failed attempts. The instructor explains a technique, you immediately see how it solves the exact problem you encountered yesterday. The theoretical concept that would have seemed abstract becomes concrete because you've already felt the pain of not understanding it. The course material becomes 1,000 times more valuable because you've already created the mental framework to receive it. You're not collecting information for potential future use. You're solving mysteries you've personally encountered. But Feynman's rebellion against traditional education went deeper than just method. It challenged the entire premise of what credentials actually certify. Cornell University, 1945. Feynman accepts a professorship despite having an unconventional teaching philosophy that makes the administration nervous. His colleagues use standard lecture notes, carefully refined over decades. Some professors have been delivering essentially the same lectures for 20 years. The system works. Why reinvent it? Feynman refuses to use anyone else's notes. More radical. He refuses to use his own notes from previous semesters. Every term, he rebuilds his lectures from scratch. Not because he forgot the material. He could teach quantum mechanics in his sleep by this point. He rebuilds because he wants to own the knowledge freshly each time. His Cornell notebooks, now archived at Caltech, reveal something startling. The same topics, Maxwell's equations, quantum mechanics, thermodynamics, explained differently each year. Not because the physics changed, but because Feynman's understanding kept evolving. He discovered new ways to think about old problems, new analogies, new connections. Each reconstruction deepened his comprehension. Students initially hated this approach. There were no perfect notes to memorize before exams. His lectures sometimes contradicted what he'd said the previous week. He'd openly admit, "I explained this wrong last class. Here's why I was wrong. Here's the better way to think about it." This was terrifying for students raised in traditional education. They wanted certainty, clear answers. Feynman gave them evolving understanding and intellectual honesty about the limits of knowledge. But something remarkable happened. Over the course of a semester, students who took Feynman's courses could actually apply physics to new situations. They could solve problems they'd never seen before. Students from conventional courses could pass tests perfectly, but froze when faced with unfamiliar scenarios. They had memorized the map. Feynman's students had learned to navigate. The difference? Feynman's students had been forced to build their own understanding from watching him build his. They couldn't just copy notes and memorize. They had to think along with him. And because he rebuilt the knowledge each time, rather than delivering prepared lectures, they saw the actual process of understanding, including the mistakes and corrections. Credentials certify that you completed a process. Understanding proves you can rebuild the process from first principles. This distinction matters more now than ever. Someone can have a computer science degree, but fail to explain basic algorithms without consulting documentation. Someone else can be self-taught but reconstruct entire systems from memory because they built everything themselves. The degree signals compliance with a program, the ability to reconstruct signals genuine mastery. This is why self-taught programmers often outperform computer science graduates on real projects. Not because formal education teaches the wrong things, but because self-taught developers were forced to own every piece of knowledge. They couldn't move forward until they truly understood. They had no choice but to reconstruct. Feynman's rebellion against using prepared lecture notes wasn't about making his job harder. It was about maintaining ownership of his understanding. The moment you stop reconstructing your knowledge, it starts decaying. The moment you rely exclusively on others' explanations, you become intellectually dependent. His famous quote captured this perfectly. "I would rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned." Credentials provide answers. Reconstruction provides questions. Questions lead to understanding. Answers often lead to the illusion of understanding. When you learn anything now, a new programming framework, a business strategy, a historical period, test yourself with this question. Can I explain this to someone without referring to any notes or documentation? If the answer is no, you don't own the knowledge yet. Keep reconstructing until the understanding becomes part of how you think, not something you need to look up. But Feynman took this principle one step further. He discovered that the ultimate test of understanding wasn't just reconstruction, it was explanation. Caltech, 1961. Richard Feynman is asked to teach introductory physics, a course usually handled by junior professors and teaching assistants. His colleagues are skeptical. Why waste a Nobel Prize winner on freshmen? Why not have him teach advanced graduate seminars where his expertise could be fully utilized? Feynman accepts immediately because he's testing a hypothesis that cuts to the heart of what understanding actually means. As he explained to the department chair, "If I can't explain something to a first-year student, then I don't really understand it myself." His preparation method became legendary among Caltech faculty. Before each lecture, Feynman would imagine explaining the concept to a 12-year-old with no background in physics, not dumbing it down, making it genuinely clear. If he couldn't make the explanation work at that level of simplicity, he'd go back to the blackboard and rederive the concept from simpler principles. This wasn't about making physics easier. It was about testing whether his understanding was real or borrowed. Jargon can hide gaps in comprehension. Complexity can mask confusion. But trying to explain quantum mechanics to someone who doesn't know calculus, that forces absolute clarity. The result of this experiment became the Feynman Lectures and Physics, published in 1964, now considered one of the greatest physics courses ever taught, not because of its advanced content, but because of its radical simplicity. Feynman took concepts that usually required years of graduate study to grasp and made them accessible to 18-year-olds. His notebooks from this period, preserved in the Caltech archives, reveal the process behind this clarity. Each lecture topic has multiple failed attempts at simple explanations, crossed out, rewritten, simplified again. He would spend hours on a single concept until he could explain it without technical jargon or circular reasoning. In a letter to a colleague, he wrote about a particularly difficult lecture on quantum electrodynamics. "I worked on this for 3 days. I couldn't reduce it to the freshman level. That means we really don't understand it." He refused to give the lecture until he found a simpler approach. Teaching forces you to confront gaps in your understanding that passive learning keeps hidden. When you read a textbook, your brain fills in gaps automatically. You encounter a complex paragraph, skim it, think you understand. Your brain's pattern recognition creates a sense of comprehension, even when real understanding is absent. But when you try to explain that concept to someone else, or to a blank page, those gaps become painfully obvious. You stumble. You use circular reasoning. You realize you can define the term, but can't explain the underlying principle. Every point where you struggle while explaining is a point where your understanding is incomplete. Traditional education never forces you to teach. You listen to lectures, memorize information, regurgitate it on exams. The illusion of understanding remains intact throughout this process. It only shatters later, when you need to actually use the knowledge in the real world and discover it's not there. Self-education through explanation destroys that illusion immediately. You can't hide behind someone else's words. You can't copy the textbook's phrasing. You must reconstruct the explanation using only what's actually in your head. This is brutal, but honest. The technique that emerged from Feynman's teaching experiments is now called the Feynman technique, though he never named it himself. The process is simple, but transformative. After learning anything, open a blank document. Write out an explanation as if teaching someone who knows nothing about the subject. Use the simplest language possible. Define every technical term. Avoid jargon unless you can explain why that specific word is necessary. Every point where you struggle is a point you didn't actually understand. Every time you reach for the textbook to check a definition, you found a gap. Go back to the source material, rebuild your understanding of that specific piece. Then try explaining again. This cycle of explanation, identification of gaps, reconstruction, and re-explanation transforms passive consumption into active mastery, and it requires zero credentials, just blank pages and intellectual honesty about what you do and don't understand. When you combine reconstruction over consumption, problem-first learning, knowledge ownership, and teaching as understanding, something radical emerges. You don't need permission to educate yourself. You need a method that forces you to build real understanding instead of collecting the appearance of knowledge. Feynman proved this across domains. Physics was his profession, but his method extended far beyond it. He taught himself biology well enough to publish papers in molecular biology journals. No degree in biology required. He decoded Mayan hieroglyphics using pattern recognition from physics. With zero formal training in archaeology, he contributed to computer science, drawing blueprints for parallel computing before the technology existed. Philosophy, cognitive science, even visual arts, he approached all of them with the same reconstruction-based method. The 1965 Nobel Prize in Physics wasn't the result of superior credentials. Feynman's academic path was unconventional at best. The Nobel came from owning his understanding so deeply that he could see connections other physicists missed. As he explained in his Nobel lecture, "I had a scheme for developing my own physics. I would work from first principles, never accepting what I couldn't rebuild myself." This approach made him dangerous to conventional academic thinking. He couldn't be fooled by complex terminology hiding simple ideas. He couldn't be impressed by credentials without competence. He had rebuilt everything himself, so he knew exactly where the gaps and contradictions lived in standard explanations. But this reveals something deeper than learning techniques. It exposes a truth about intelligence that the education system actively obscures. Intelligence isn't about IQ scores or degrees or how quickly you can memorize information. It's about intellectual honesty. The willingness to say, "I don't understand this yet," and sit with that discomfort instead of pretending. The courage to start with blank pages instead of hiding behind borrowed explanations. The discipline to reconstruct knowledge from first principles until it becomes inseparable from how you think. Traditional education conflates credentials with competence because credentials are easier to measure. You can count degrees, you can rank test scores, but you can't easily measure whether someone truly owns their knowledge. So the system optimizes for what it can measure, producing graduates who excel at pattern matching but struggle with novel problems. Feynman's method optimizes for the opposite. It makes measurement irrelevant. Either you can reconstruct the knowledge or you can't. Either you can explain it simply or you can't. Either you own the understanding or you're borrowing someone else's. One approach produces resumes. The other produces understanding. One creates dependence on institutions to certify your competence. The other creates intellectual independence. You don't need the university. You need the method. You don't need the degree. You need the discipline to rebuild knowledge from first principles until understanding becomes permanent. You don't need permission from institutions that profit from credential scarcity. You need blank notebooks and the courage to start from nothing. Schools won't teach you this method because it threatens their fundamental business model. It reveals an uncomfortable truth they can't acknowledge. Understanding can't be purchased with tuition or certified with diplomas. It must be built, painfully, through reconstruction and honest self-assessment. Feynman's blank notebooks weren't just a study technique. They were an act of intellectual rebellion, a refusal to accept that others controlled access to knowledge, a demonstration that self-education through reconstruction could produce deeper understanding than passive consumption of expert-approved content. The system told you that you needed their credentials to prove you're smart enough. Feynman proved you just needed curiosity, blank pages, and the courage to reconstruct everything yourself. The system said you must consume their curriculum in their sequence at their pace. Feynman showed that owning a single concept deeply beats borrowing 100 concepts shallowly. The question isn't whether you're smart enough to educate yourself. The question is whether you're willing to endure the struggle of starting with blank pages, to attack problems before reading solutions, to rebuild understanding instead of collecting explanations, to own your knowledge instead of renting it for exam week. This method is available to anyone. It requires no tuition, no admission standards, no institutional permission. Just the intellectual honesty to admit what you don't understand and the discipline to sit with difficult problems until they yield. But this principle extends further than just learning techniques. The same logic that made Feynman a self-taught genius explains another pattern in his life, why he deliberately forgot what he learned. That seeming contradiction reveals something even deeper about how understanding actually works, and why the best physicists regularly destroy their own knowledge to rebuild it stronger.